Magic cannot mend what is shattered to the core. Draco came only to help, but how can he face the shadows when she is waiting for him in every room? The rain in Derbyshire did not fall. It conspired. It was a relentless, weeping grey curtain that had been drawn tight around the stone cottage for 3 weeks straight, seeking out every weakness in the mortar, every loose slate, every forgotten crack in the wards. Hermione Granger sat on the bottom step of the main staircase, her forehead resting against the cold, dark wood of the banister. The house was groaning. It was a low, mournful sound, like a ship listing in a storm, vibrating through the floorboards and up into her spine. Above her, somewhere in the intricate, magical darkness of the attic, a beam shifted with a sound like a pistol crack. She didn't flinch. She simply closed her eyes tighter, wrapping her cardigan, an oversized knitted thing that smelled faintly of old parchment and lavender, closer around her ribs. "Reparo," she whispered, pointing her wand lazily over her shoulder at a dripping patch on the ceiling. The water paused, shimmering in mid-air, and then, with a stubborn, defiant drip, continued its descent, splashing into the overflowed bucket on the rug. The magic wasn't sticking. That was the problem with old wizarding houses. They were moody, sentient beasts. And this house, inherited from a distant great-aunt she had barely known, was dying of a broken heart. Or perhaps just rot. It was hard to tell the difference lately. Hermione felt a distinct kinship with the structure. She too felt structural integrity failing under the weight of expectation. 5 years post-war, and she was the deputy head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. She was successful. She was admired. She was utterly hollowed out. She had come here to rest, to hide, to read books that had nothing to do with dark artifacts or legislative reform. Instead, she was waging a losing war against rising damp and a staircase that threatened to collapse if she looked at it too sharply. A heavy, iron-fisted knock echoed through the hallway. Hermione stiffened. She checked her watch. It was past 7 in the evening. The shadows in the corners of the room were stretching, long and spidery. She wasn't expecting anyone. Harry and Ginny were in Wales. Ron was managing the shop. No one knew she was here except for the select few who approved her leave of absence. The knock came again, precise, demanding. 3 raps, perfectly spaced. She stood up, her knees cracking, and smoothed the frizzy halo of her hair. She hadn't looked in a mirror in 2 days. She wasn't wearing shoes. She walked down the narrow hallway, the runner rug damp beneath her wool socks, and gripped the cold brass handle. She pulled the door open, ready to tell a lost villager that the road to town was the other way. The words died in her throat, turning into a sharp, jagged inhale. Draco Malfoy stood on her doorstep. He was framed by the deluge, the water cascading off the brim of a black coat that looked tailored to withstand an apocalypse. He was pale, startlingly so against the encroaching night, his hair shorter than she remembered, severed with military precision. He held a leather satchel in one gloved hand. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain hissing against the stone and the frantic beating of her own heart. The air between them instantly grew thin, charged with the static of 10 years of hostility and 5 years of absolute silence. "Granger," he said. His voice was lower, roughened by the weather, or perhaps by time. It lacked the sneer she had braced herself for. It was flat, stripped of affect. Malfoy, she breathed, her grip tightening on the door. What? What are you doing here? He didn't step forward, but he didn't retreat. He simply looked at her, his grey eyes sweeping over her dishevelled appearance. The oversized cardigan, the mismatched socks, the exhaustion etched under her eyes like bruises. He catalogued it all without a flicker of judgment, which was somehow worse than mockery. "Potter," he said. "He sent an owl, said you were living in a structural hazard." Hermione's cheeks burned. Of course, Harry, the overprotective saviour who couldn't let her drown in peace. "I'm fine. The house is fine. It's just a bit of damp." As if on cue, a loud, grinding screech echoed from the staircase behind her, followed by the heavy thud of plaster hitting the floor. Malfoy tilted his head slightly, listening to the house's complaint. He looked past her, into the gloom of the hallway. That sounded like a load-bearing charm failing on a 3rd century oak beam. If it snaps, the roof comes down. You'll be flattened before you can pronounce the counter-curse. "I can handle it," she lied, lifting her chin. The defiance felt brittle, like dried leaves. "You can't," he countered, finally meeting her eyes. There was no malice in it, just a brutal, weary honesty. "You're a genius at arithmancy and charms, Granger, but you don't know old magic. This house is sick. You're trying to bandage a hemorrhage." He shifted his weight, and for a second she saw a crack in his composure, a shiver he quickly suppressed. He was soaked. "I fix things now," he added quietly. "That's what I do. It's my profession." Hermione stared at him. Draco Malfoy, the Prince of Slytherin, the boy who had never lifted a finger unless it was to point a wand or an insult, was standing in the rain offering to do manual labour. The absurdity of it made her dizzy. But then she looked at his hands. Even in gloves they looked stronger. There was a stillness to him she didn't recognise. The wind howled, blowing a spray of icy rain into her face. She shivered violently. Malfoy stepped closer, an instinctual movement to block the wind with his body. He smelled of rain, ozone, and expensive cold cedar. The scent was confusingly familiar and alien all at once. "Let me look," he said. It wasn't a request. It was a negotiation. 1 hour. If I can't stabilize the staircase, I leave. If I can, you let me finish the job. Hermione looked at the dark circles under his eyes, mirroring her own. She saw a man who looked like he hadn't slept in a decade. She stepped back, opening the door wider. "Take your shoes off," she murmured, turning her back to him to hide the tremor in her hands. "I just cleaned the rug." She hadn't cleaned the rug. It was covered in dust. But she needed to say something that sounded like she was still in charge. She heard the heavy door click shut, sealing out the storm, and the soft, wet thud of boots being removed. The air in the hallway changed instantly. It felt heavier, crowded by his presence. Malfoy was a large man, tall, broad-shouldered, and in this narrow, cramped cottage, he felt like a storm cloud brought indoors. "The stairs?" he asked. "This way." She led him into the foyer. The candlelight flickered as he passed, the shadows dancing wildly against the peeling wallpaper. Malfoy didn't look at the decor. He walked straight to the base of the staircase, dropped his leather bag, and peeled off his wet coat. Underneath, he wore a black turtleneck and dark trousers that were meant for work, not fashion. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms that were pale and corded with muscle. Hermione found her gaze drifting to his left arm, searching for the dark mark. It was there, faded to a silvery scar, but he made no move to hide it. He simply reached out and placed both palms flat against the wooden newel post. He closed his eyes. Hermione watched, fascinated despite herself. He wasn't casting a spell. He was listening. "It's in pain," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "The wood. The memory of the wood," he corrected, opening his eyes. He crouched down, running his long fingers along the skirting board where the rot was darkest. Magic leaves residue. Panic, fear, neglect. It seeps into the grain. This house, it's been lonely for a very long time. Hermione felt a sudden, sharp sting of tears. She wrapped her arms around herself. "It's just a house, Malfoy." He looked up at her from the floor. The angle made him look vulnerable, but his eyes were piercing. "Is it? Then why does it feel like it's screaming?" He stood up, brushing dust from his knees. He walked to his bag and pulled out a set of silver tools, chisels, a hammer with runes etched into the handle, and a jar of something that glowed with a soft amber light. "The central stringer is cracked," he diagnosed, his tone shifting to pure professionalism. "The charm holding it up is inverted. Every time you walk up, you're actually pushing the support structure down. Paradoxical magic. Nasty stuff." "Can you fix it?" Hermione asked, her voice small. She hated feeling small. She was Hermione Granger. She defeated Dark Lords. Why couldn't she fix a bloody staircase? "Yes." He didn't look at her. He was already measuring the air with his wand, muttering calculations. "I need silence, Granger, and I need access to the cellar to check the foundation stones." "The cellar is... I haven't been down there," she admitted. "The door is jammed." Malfoy turned to her. A ghost of a smirk touched his lips. Not cruel, just knowing. "Of course it is. Avoidance seems to be the theme of the interior design here." He walked past her toward the cellar door, his shoulder brushing hers. The contact was fleeting, barely a graze, but Hermione felt a jolt of electricity zip through her arm. It wasn't a spark of attraction, it was a shock of reality. Draco Malfoy was in her house. He was real, he was solid, and he was taking apart her defenses one wooden board at a time. She watched him kneel before the cellar door, his wand moving in intricate, fluid patterns she didn't recognize. With a soft click, the jammed lock sprang open. "I'm going down," he said, glancing back at her. The candlelight caught the sharp angle of his cheekbone. "Make tea. You look like you're about to faint." "I don't take orders from you," she snapped, the old reflex firing automatically. "It wasn't an order," he said softly, his grey eyes holding hers. "It was a suggestion. You're shivering, Granger." He disappeared into the darkness of the cellar. Hermione stood alone in the hallway. The house was quiet for the first time all day. The groaning had stopped, replaced by the rhythmic, muffled sound of Malfoy moving below her feet. Thud, scrape, thud. It was a terrifying sound. It was the sound of someone else taking control. She walked into the kitchen, her legs feeling like lead. She filled the kettle with shaking hands. The window above the sink was black with night and rain, reflecting her own ghostly image. She looked like a stranger to herself. Make tea. She reached for the tin of Earl Grey, but her hand paused. Malfoy. What did he drink? Did he drink tea? Or did he drink ambrosia or dragon blood, or whatever pure-blood heirs drank when they weren't being miserable? She hesitated, then reached for a second mug. It was chipped. Everything she owned was slightly broken. From the cellar, a wave of warmth suddenly pulsed upward, rippling through the floorboards. It felt like the house taking a deep, shuddering breath. The chill in the air dissipated slightly. Hermione gripped the edge of the counter. He was actually doing it. He was fixing the foundation. She waited for the resentment to come, the anger that he was here, invading her sanctuary. But as the kettle began to whistle, a different feeling settled in her chest. It was heavy and frighteningly seductive. Relief. Someone else was holding up the roof, just for an hour. She poured the water, the steam curling around her face. She would give him his hour. She would let him fix the stairs. And then she would kick him out into the rain before he could see that the cracks in the walls were nothing compared to the cracks in her. But as she set the 2 mugs on a tray, Hermione Granger had a sinking feeling that the storm outside was not going to clear, and that Draco Malfoy was not the kind of man who left a job half-finished. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was no longer the oppressive, holding its breath silence of a dying house. It was the silence of a pause, a deep, settling exhale. Hermione stood in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around the ceramic warmth of the mug, staring at the steam rising in erratic spirals. She could feel the change in the floorboards beneath her feet, the subtle, constant vibration that had plagued her for weeks. The house, shivering, had stopped. It was unnerving. She had grown so accustomed to the instability that the solidity felt suspicious. Heavy footsteps ascended the cellar stairs. Not the tentative creak of wood under pressure, but the firm, rhythmic thud of boots on something solid. Draco emerged from the hallway shadows into the kitchen's dim yellow light. He looked wrecked. In the span of 40 minutes, the pristine, armored wizard who had arrived at her door had been dismantled. His black turtleneck was dusted with grey plaster and ancient soot. A streak of grime cut across his sharp jawline, marring the pale skin. His hair, usually so severe, was falling into his eyes. He didn't look at her immediately. He walked to the sink, turned on the tap, and shoved his hands under the icy stream. The water ran grey, swirling down the drain. The foundation stone was cracked, he said, his voice rough, addressing the window in front of him. Someone tried to anchor a protection ward to a limestone block that was already calcified. It was eating the magic of the house to sustain itself. Hermione watched the muscles in his back shift as he scrubbed his hands. The intimacy of it, Draco Malfoy washing up at her kitchen sink, sent a bizarre ripple of vertigo through her. "Is it fixed?" she asked, stepping forward slightly. He turned off the tap and reached for the towel she had left out. He dried his hands methodically, finger by finger, staring at the fabric as if it held the secrets of the universe. "Stabilized. I rerouted the ley line. The stairs won't collapse and the floor won't swallow you whole. But the roof..." He looked up, his grey eyes catching hers. "The roof is a disaster waiting for a strong wind." Hermione tightened her grip on the mug. "I can manage the roof." "No, you can't." He dropped the towel on the counter. "The support beams are rotted through with damp. You can't spell fix wood that's turned to sponge, Granger. It needs to be grafted with new oak, iron charmed." "I don't have iron charmed oak," she snapped, defensive exhaustion flaring up. "I have a leaking ceiling and a backlog of ministry paperwork." "I have the wood in my bag," he said simply. He walked over to the small kitchen table and pulled out a chair. He didn't ask if he could sit. He just collapsed into it, his long legs stretching out, encroaching on her space. He looked exhausted, a deep-seated weariness that went beyond physical labor. Hermione hesitated, then pushed the second mug of tea across the table toward him. He looked at it, then at her. "Earl Grey," she murmured. "I didn't have anything else." Malfoy wrapped his long fingers around the mug. He didn't say thank you. He just lifted it to his lips and took a long, slow swallow. He closed his eyes as the heat hit him, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. "It's serviceable," he muttered. "High praise," she retorted, sitting opposite him. They sat in silence, the rain drumming a frantic rhythm against the window pane. The wind outside was picking up, howling around the corners of the cottage like a wounded animal. But inside, the kitchen felt strangely insulated. For the first time in weeks, the draft wasn't biting at Hermione's ankles. She watched him over the rim of her cup. He was staring into the dark depths of his tea, his expression unreadable. "Why are you really here, Malfoy?" she asked quietly. "Harry asked you. Fine. But you came. You're sitting in my kitchen covered in 3 centuries of dust. Why?" He didn't look up. His thumb traced the chipped rim of the mug. "Because it's quiet," he said. The admission seemed to surprise him. He cleared his throat, stiffening. "And because I owe Potter a life debt, consider this an installment. Fixing my stairs clears a life debt? Preventing the Golden Girl from being crushed by her own architecture? Yes, it counts." A gust of wind slammed against the house with such force that the windows rattled in their frames. The lights flickered and died. Total darkness engulfed them, save for the faint grey luminescence of the storm outside. "Lumos," Hermione whispered instantly. The tip of her wand ignited, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. Malfoy hadn't moved. He was just a dark shape across the table, calm amidst the chaos. "The wards," he said, his voice cutting through the gloom. "The storm is interacting with the fresh magic in the foundation. The house is locking down to integrate the changes." Locking down? Hermione's heart skipped a beat. "What does that mean?" "It means..." Malfoy stood up, his wand lighting up as well, illuminating his sharp features. "That nothing goes in or out until the magical mortar sets. Anti-apparition, flu network suppression." He walked to the window and peered out into the churning blackness. "I'm stuck here, Granger." Hermione felt a wave of panic, followed immediately by that traitorous, warm relief. She wasn't alone in the dark. For how long? Until the storm breaks. Or the house decides it's safe. Could be hours, could be morning. He turned back to her, the light from his wand casting hollows under his cheekbones. "I hope you have a spare blanket. The sofa looks lumpy." The sofa was indeed lumpy. It was a velvet monstrosity she had inherited with the house, smelling of dust and dried roses. Hermione stood in the doorway of the living room, holding a heavy wool blanket and a pillow. Malfoy had transfigured the coffee table into a workbench and was currently polishing his silver chisels with a cloth, the light of his wand floating above him like a personal star. He had removed his boots. His socks were black, expensive wool. The domesticity of it, Draco Malfoy in his socks, was jarring. "Here," she said, tossing the bedding onto the sofa. He paused, looking at the bundle. "You take the bedroom upstairs." "It's my house, Malfoy." "Just checking. Chivalry is dead, but old habits die hard." He picked up the blanket. It was one of hers, a tartan throw she usually kept on her bed. He hesitated for a fraction of a second as he unfolded it, likely catching her scent, vanilla and old paper, but his face remained impassive. "Do you need anything else?" she asked, lingering. She should go upstairs. She should lock her door and read until she fell asleep, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. "No," he said, turning his back to her to arrange the pillow. "Go to sleep, Granger. You look like an inferius." "Good night, Malfoy." "Night." She walked up the stairs that were now silent and solid as stone beneath her feet. She stopped on the landing, listening. She could hear him moving below, the soft rustle of fabric, the click of a tool being put away. She went into her bedroom and closed the door, but she didn't lock it. For the first time in 3 weeks, Hermione didn't cast a collision warning charm on the ceiling. She didn't check the window latches 3 times. She crawled into her cold bed, pulled the duvet up to her chin, and listened to the rain. Usually the storm kept her awake, her mind racing with anxiety about leaks and drafts. Tonight, the sound was distant, muffled. There was a wizard downstairs, a wizard she had spent half her life hating and the other half trying to forget. A wizard who had been a Death Eater. But tonight, he was just a man who had fixed her foundation and was sleeping on her lumpy sofa. The tension in her chest, a knot she had been carrying since the war ended, loosened just enough to let her breathe. She fell asleep instantly. She woke to the smell of coffee. Rich, dark, expensive coffee that definitely did not come from her pantry. Hermione blinked, disoriented. The light filtering through the curtains was pale and watery, but the rain had stopped. The house was silent. No groans, no creaks. She threw off the covers and grabbed her dressing gown, tying it tightly around her waist. She ran a hand through her hair. It was hopeless, and padded barefoot down the stairs. The living room was empty. The blanket was folded with military precision at the foot of the sofa. The pillow was fluffed. It was as if he had never been there. Panic flared. Had he left? Had he fixed the stairs and vanished, leaving her alone in the silence? She hurried into the kitchen. He was there. Draco was standing on a stool in front of the window, his sleeves rolled up past his elbows again. He was working on the window sash, a small silver tool in his teeth, his hands expertly maneuvering a piece of wood into the frame. A French press sat on the table, half empty. 2 mugs. One was hers, the chipped one. The other was a sleek black travel mug he must have had in his bottomless bag. He heard her enter, but didn't turn around immediately. He took the tool out of his mouth. "The sash cord was snapped," he said, his voice rasping slightly with morning disuse. "Draft was coming in right over the sink. No wonder you're freezing." Hermione stared at his back. The morning light caught the sharp definition of his shoulder blades through the tight black fabric of his shirt. "You're still here," she said. It came out breathless. He turned then, stepping down from the stool. He looked more rested than the night before, though the shadows under his eyes were still there. He looked comfortable. He moved through her kitchen as if he understood its geometry better than she did. "Storm broke an hour ago," he said, "but I found dry rot in the window frame. Couldn't leave it. You made coffee. I did. Your tea situation is tragic, Granger. I keep emergency supplies." He gestured to the French press. "Help yourself. It's strong enough to wake the dead." Hermione walked to the table. She poured the coffee into her chipped mug. It was black as tar and smelled like heaven. She took a sip. It was bitter, complex, and grounded her instantly. "Thank you," she said, leaning against the counter, watching him. He was back at the window, testing the sash. It slid up and down smoothly, without a sound. He nodded to himself, satisfied. "I have to go to the manor," he said, without looking at her. "Get materials for the roof, some treated oak, slate." Hermione felt a sudden, sharp drop in her stomach. "Oh, right, of course. I'll be back at noon." He turned to face her, wiping his hands on his trousers. His gaze was direct, challenging her to object. "You're coming back?" "I told you," he said, picking up his leather jacket from the back of the chair. "I don't leave a job unfinished. And this house—" He looked around the kitchen, his expression softening into something that looked almost like pain. "This house needs a lot of work." He walked toward her, stopping just inches away to grab his wand from the table. The air between them crackled, cold cedar and warm sleep. He was too close. For a second, Hermione thought he might say something else, something personal. Instead, he just nodded. "Don't touch the window until the sealant dries." And then, with a sharp crack, he apparated, leaving a swirl of displaced air and the lingering scent of coffee. Hermione stood alone in her kitchen. The window was fixed, the floor was steady, the coffee was hot. She looked at the empty space where he had been standing. The house felt warm. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel the urge to run away. She felt the urge to wait. She took another sip of coffee, the bitterness turning sweet on her tongue. Noon. He would be back at noon. She had 4 hours to clean the living room. Noon arrived with the chiming of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound Hermione hadn't heard in months because the pendulum had been stuck. Now it swung with a steady, rhythmic tock, a heartbeat restored to the chest of the house. Hermione was waiting in the kitchen. She had spent the last 4 hours in a fugue state of nervous energy, scrubbing surfaces that were already clean and rearranging piles of books into slightly neater piles. She told herself she was simply organizing her workspace. She refused to acknowledge that she had changed her jumper twice, settling on a soft, oatmeal-colored cashmere that felt less like armor and more like clothes. At 12 o'clock precisely, the air in the garden shimmered. There was no crack of apparition this time, just a displacement of pressure, a silent arrival that spoke of refined, disciplined magic. Through the newly fixed window, she saw him. Draco was not alone. Floating behind him like a obedient caravan were stacks of slate, long beams of pale raw timber, and buckets that smelled, even through the glass, of tar and solvent. He looked up, catching her eye through the pane. He didn't smile. He just jerked his chin toward the back door, a silent command to open up. Hermione hurried to the door, wiping her damp palms on her jeans. When she opened it, the smell of fresh sawdust and ozone rushed in, overriding the musty scent of the cottage. "Clear the hallway," he said by way of greeting. He was wearing a different shirt today, grey, flannel rolled to the elbows, and the same heavy work boots. "The oak needs to go straight up to the attic. It's temperamental. If it touches the walls before it's installed, it'll warp." Hermione stepped back, pressing herself against the wall as he guided the floating timber past her. The wood was massive, rough-hewn beams that looked heavy enough to crush a carriage. Draco moved them with a flick of his wand, his movements sharp and economical. "I didn't know you could get this kind of timber anymore," Hermione said, watching a beam navigate the turn of the stairs. "Not since the restrictions on magical forestry." "You can't," Draco said, not breaking his concentration. "This is from the manor's private reserves. It's 300 years old. It remembers the same weather as this house. They'll get along." He walked past her, and the heat radiating from him was palpable. He was already working, his mind already 3 steps ahead in the architecture of the repair. Hermione felt a sudden, sharp pang of uselessness. This was her house, her sanctuary, and she was merely a spectator in its resurrection. She followed him up the stairs, past the second floor, to the narrow, creaking door that led to the attic. Draco banished the door open without touching it. The attic was a cathedral of dust and shadows. Sunlight pierced through the gaps in the slate roof like laser beams, illuminating the swirling motes of dust in the air. It was freezing up here, the wind whistling through the holes where the roof had surrendered to the elements. Draco lowered the beams onto the floor with a heavy thud that shook dust from the rafters. He turned in a slow circle, surveying the damage. "It's worse than I thought," he muttered. He looked at Hermione. "The ridge beam is snapped. The whole roof is being held up by habit and spiderwebs. I put a sticking charm on it last winter," Hermione offered weakly. Draco looked at her, one eyebrow arching perfectly. "A sticking charm? On a 5-ton slate roof? That's like trying to hold back a tsunami with a tea strainer, Granger." "I was busy," she defended, crossing her arms. "I was drafting the Centaur liaison bill." "Well, while you were saving the world, your house was preparing to kill you." He stripped off his jacket, tossing it onto a trunk covered in cobwebs. "I need to strip the old slate. Then we replace the rafters. It's going to be loud. You might want to go downstairs." "No." The word was out before she could think about it. Draco paused, his hand halfway to his tool belt. He looked at her. "No?" "I want to help," she said, stepping further into the dusty gloom. "It's my house. I'm not going to sit downstairs drinking tea while you do all the work." He studied her for a long moment, his grey eyes assessing her resolve. Then he let out a short, sharp breath, almost a laugh, but without the humour. "Fine, but don't use your wand unless I tell you to. This isn't charms class. Construction magic is volatile. It requires intent, not just incantation. If you wave that vine wood around carelessly, you'll bring the chimney down." "I am not careless," she huffed. "Then grab a crowbar." He kicked a heavy iron tool across the floorboards toward her. It skidded to a halt at her feet. "Manual labor first, magic second. We need to pry up the rotten slate." For the next 3 hours, Hermione Granger, the brightest witch of her age, learned the humbling art of demolition. It was grueling. The slate was heavy, cold and slick with decades of moss. Draco worked on the north side, Hermione on the south. The silence between them was filled with the scrape of metal on stone, the grunt of exertion, and the clatter of debris sliding down the roof to the garden below. Hermione's muscles burned. Her hands, usually stained with ink, were now coated in grey dust and grit. But there was a strange meditative quality to it. There was no politics here, no moral ambiguity, There was just the slate, the lever, and the force required to move it. She watched Draco covertly when she paused to wipe sweat from her forehead. He worked with a terrifying intensity. He didn't use magic for the prying. He used his body. She saw the strain in his shoulders, the flex of his back muscles through the flannel shirt. He moved with a rhythm that suggested he had done this 1,000 times. He wasn't just fixing the house, he was punishing himself. Every strike of the hammer, every heavy lift seemed like penance. "You're doing it wrong." His voice cut through the air, startling her. He was standing right behind her. She hadn't heard him move. Hermione stiffened. "I'm getting them up, aren't I?" "You're using your wrist as the fulcrum," he said, stepping closer. He smelled of sweat now, and old wood, and that sharp metallic scent of ozone. "You'll snap your wrist before you snap the nail. Use your shoulder." He reached out. For a second, she thought he was going to take the tool from her. Instead, his gloved hand covered hers on the crowbar. The contact was electric. Even through the layers of leather and wool, the heat of his hand seared into her skin. He stepped in, his chest brushing her back, aligning his body with hers to show the angle. "Lean into it," he murmured, his voice low, vibrating near her ear. "Let your weight do the work. Don't fight the house. Work with it." Hermione stopped breathing. She was trapped between the cold, unyielding roof and the solid, warm wall of Draco Malfoy. She could feel the steady thrum of his magic, a low-frequency hum that felt dark and grounding. "Like this," he said. He applied pressure, guiding her movement. The slate popped free with a satisfying crack, sliding easily from its bed. "See?" he whispered. He didn't pull away immediately. For 2 heartbeats, they stood frozen in the dusty attic light. Hermione could feel his breath on her hair. She felt a sudden, terrifying urge to lean back, to rest her weight against him, to let him take the strain not just of the roof, but of everything. Then he stepped back. The cold air rushed into the space between them. "Keep going," he said, his voice flat. He turned and walked back to his side of the roof, not looking back. Hermione stood there, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She gripped the crowbar until her knuckles turned white, staring at the empty space where the slate used to be. Work with it. She swallowed hard, adjusted her grip, and attacked the next slate with a ferocity that had nothing to do with home repair. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, turning the sky a bruised purple, the roof was stripped. The attic was open to the heavens, the first stars beginning to blink into existence above the skeleton of the rafters. Hermione sat on a transfigured crate, her arms trembling with exhaustion. She was covered in soot. There was a smudge of dirt on her nose. She felt incredibly, wonderfully tired. Not the mental exhaustion that left her staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., but a physical depletion that promised deep, dreamless sleep. Draco was securing a tarp over the opening with quick, complex wand movements. The translucent, magical barrier shimmered, sealing out the night air but letting the starlight filter through. He finished and turned to her. He looked rough. His hair was a mess, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the hollow of his throat. He looked less like a Malfoy and more like a man. "We need food," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I can cook," Hermione said, making to stand up. Her legs protested. She winced. "Sit down, Granger. You look like you've been in a duel." He wiped his hands on a rag. "I have supplies." He walked over to his satchel, the bag that seemingly held the entire contents of his life, and pulled out a brown paper bag. From it, he produced a loaf of crusty bread, a block of cheese, 2 apples, and a bottle of wine. "Rustic," he commented, slicing the cheese with a pocket knife that looked sharper than a scalpel. "But effective." He handed her a slice of bread and cheese. Hermione took it, her fingers brushing his. The tension from earlier, the moment with the crowbar, was still there, humming under the surface, but it had shifted. It was less volatile, more companionable. They ate in silence, sitting on the dusty floor of the attic under the false sky of the top. The wine was rich and dark, warming her blood. "Why do you do this?" Hermione asked suddenly. The question had been burning in her throat all afternoon. "You're a Malfoy. You have vaults full of gold. You don't need to fix roofs." Draco took a long sip of wine, his eyes fixed on the stars above them. "Gold doesn't fix anything, Granger. We proved that." He leaned back against a stack of timber, stretching his legs out. "After the trials, I couldn't be in the manor. It was too loud, not with noise, but with memories. I tried to travel, but I felt like a ghost. Then I fixed a gate for an old squib in Yorkshire, just a simple hinge. But when I finished, it worked. It was broken, and then it wasn't. And I had done it." He looked at his hands, turning them over in the dim light. They were scarred, rougher than they had ever been in school. "There's an honesty to it," he said quietly. "Wood doesn't lie. Stone doesn't care about blood status. If you treat it right, it holds. If you don't, it falls. It's simple. I needed simple." Hermione watched him, her chest aching. She saw the boy he had been, the terrified teenager in the astronomy tower, overlaid with this man who sought redemption in hinges and slate. "You're good at it," she said softly. He glanced at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "I know. No, I mean, you're good with the house. It likes you." She gestured around them. "It hasn't groaned once since you started working. It's not sentient, Granger. It's just mechanics." "It is sentient," she insisted. "And it trusts you." Draco looked away, his jaw tightening. "It shouldn't. I'm not reliable." "You came back at noon," she pointed out. He was silent for a long time. The wind buffeted the magical tarp, a soft, rhythmic thumping sound. "I said I would," he muttered. He drained his glass and stood up abruptly, the moment of vulnerability snapping shut like a book. "We start at dawn. The rafters need to be set before the next rain front comes in. Tuesday, according to the forecast." Hermione blinked. "Tuesday? That's 2 days away." "Yes." He looked down at her, his face unreadable in the shadows. "I'll need to stay. Traveling back and forth wastes daylight." He waited. He was giving her an out. He was waiting for her to say no, to tell him to go to a hotel to draw the line. Hermione looked at the tarp, then at the empty wine bottle, and finally at him. The thought of him leaving, of the house returning to its cold, hollow silence, made her stomach drop. "The sofa is still lumpy," she said. A corner of Draco's mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, but it was close. "I'll transfigure the cushions," he said. "Go to bed, Granger. You're falling asleep sitting up." "I'm fine," she lied, standing up. Her knees buckled slightly, and purely on instinct, Draco's hand shot out, gripping her elbow to steady her. His grip was firm, warm, and secure. He didn't let go immediately. He held her there, upright, his thumb brushing the fabric of her sleeve. "You're not fine," he said softly, "but the house is standing. Let that be enough for today." He released her. Hermione walked to the door, her heart full of a strange, terrifying hope. She paused at the threshold. "Draco?" He froze. She had never used his first name, not once. "Thank you." He didn't turn around. He just nodded, a sharp, jerky motion, and bent down to pick up the tools. Hermione went downstairs to her bedroom. She didn't lock the door. She lay in the dark, listening to the silence of her home. And for the first time in 5 years, she didn't feel the need to cast a silencing charm on her own thoughts. Downstairs, the floorboards settled, a soft, comfortable sound. He was staying. Sunday arrived not with a bang, but with a drift of silence so profound it felt like a spell. Hermione woke slowly, surfacing from a sleep so deep it felt medicinal. The usual knot of anxiety in her stomach, the one that catalogued the day's tasks before her eyes even opened, was absent. In its place was a strange, heavy tranquility. She lay still, listening. The house was breathing. For months the cottage had wheezed, the pipes had rattled, the floorboards had shrieked under the weight of unseen ghosts, and the windows had chattered in their frames. Now the silence was solid. It was the silence of a structure that was no longer fighting gravity. Draco. The name settled in her mind, carrying a weight that was both terrifying and comforting. He was still here. Hermione got up, pulling on a thick pair of wool socks. She moved through the hallway, her fingers trailing along the wall. The plaster felt warmer, as if the house's circulation had been restored. She found him in the library. It was the one room she had forbidden herself to worry about, despite the fact that the damp had begun to curl the edges of her first editions. She paused in the doorway, the breath catching in her throat. Draco was standing on the rolling ladder, suspended halfway up the towering shelves on the west wall. He was shirtless. The morning sun, filtered through the high arched window, painted him in stark relief. He was lean, built of sharp angles and defined muscle that moved fluidly under pale skin. Across his back, a constellation of faint silver scars mapped a history of violence, remnants of Sectum Sempra, perhaps, or other darker curses she didn't want to name. He was working on the moulding that crowned the bookshelves. His wand was tucked into the back pocket of his trousers, and he was using a small, precise trowel to apply a shimmering, translucent paste to the wood. He looked like a statue brought to life by some reluctant god. Beautiful, damaged, and completely absorbed in the act of preservation. Hermione watched him for a long moment, feeling a flush rise from her chest to her neck. It wasn't just the physicality of him, though that was undeniable. It was the care. He was fixing her library. He was sealing the room that held her soul. Staring is rude, Granger. He didn't turn around. He didn't stop working. His voice was low, rasping with the morning, echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. Hermione jumped, nearly tripping over her own feet. I wasn't staring. I was inspecting. Inspecting my trapezius. He turned then, looking down at her from the ladder. His face was impassive, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Amusement? Challenge? The moulding was separated from the wall. Humidity. I'm resealing it with a beeswax and resin compound. It breathes, but it keeps the moisture out. I didn't ask you to do the library, she said, crossing her arms to hide the fact that her hands were trembling. The library is the heart of the house, Draco said simply. He wiped a smudge of resin from his thumb. If the heart rots, the body dies. Basic architecture. He climbed down the ladder, his movements graceful and controlled. When his boots hit the floor, he was suddenly very tall and very close. He grabbed his shirt from the back of an armchair, a grey linen thing that looked soft with wear, and pulled it on, buttoning it halfway with maddening slowness. "Coffee is in the kitchen," he said, "and I fixed the toaster. It no longer tries to incinerate the bread out of spite." "You're enjoying this," she accused, though her voice lacked any real bite. "Playing house, fixing my life." Draco froze. His hands stilled on the buttons of his shirt. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, the temperature dropping a few degrees. The easy banter evaporated, replaced by the familiar, sharp tension of their past. "I'm not playing house," he said, his voice cold. "I'm doing a job. Don't confuse competence with intimacy, Granger." He walked past her, his shoulder checking hers, hard enough to be felt, soft enough to be an apology. He vanished into the hallway. Hermione stood alone in the library, surrounded by the smell of beeswax and the lingering ghost of his warmth. The seesaw tipped, warmth to cold, trust to defense. She let out a shaky breath. He was right. She was confusing things. She was letting the domesticity bleed into the reality. He was Draco Malfoy. He was here because of a life debt and a storm. But as she walked to the shelves and ran her hand over the freshly sealed moulding, feeling the smooth, perfect work, she knew it was a lie. You don't fix a library like this for a debt. You do it because you care about the books, or the person who reads them. The afternoons settled into a strange, fragile rhythm. It was raining again, a soft, steady drizzle that blurred the horizon. They were in the living room. The fire was lit, crackling cheerfully in the hearth that Draco had swept and repointed the day before. Hermione was curled up on the sofa, the cushions now firm and plush thanks to his transfiguration, reading a thick treatise on magical contract law. Draco was sitting on the floor by the coffee table, surrounded by sketches of the roof trusses. He was drawing with a charcoal stick, his hand moving in quick, sharp strokes. They hadn't spoken in 2 hours. The silence wasn't empty. It was companionable, woven with the sounds of the fire and the turning of pages. Hermione found herself reading the same paragraph 4 times. Her eyes kept drifting over the top of her book to look at him. He was frowning in concentration, a small furrow between his brows. He looked younger like this, less haunted. "You're thinking too loud," he murmured, not looking up from his sketch. Hermione smiled behind her book. "I'm not thinking anything." "You're thinking about Tuesday," he said. "You're wondering if the rain will hold, or if I'll leave even if it doesn't." Hermione lowered the book. He had an annoying habit of being right. "Will you?" Draco stopped drawing. He sat back on his heels, looking at the charcoal smudged on his fingers. "The trusses need to be reinforced with iron braces. I can't do that in the rain. The magic won't set. So I'm not leaving on Tuesday." The relief that washed over her was so intense, it was physical. Her shoulders dropped. "Oh, good. I mean, that's logical." Draco looked up at her then. His expression was guarded, his grey eyes searching her face. You should want me to leave, Granger. I'm cluttering up your living room. I'm drinking your coffee. He gestured vaguely at himself. I'm me. The house likes you, she said softly, repeating her words from the attic. And it's nice, not being alone. The admission hung in the air, fragile as glass. Draco flinched. It was a microscopic movement, a tightening of the jaw, but she saw it. He looked down, scrubbing at a charcoal stain on the floorboards with his thumb. Don't get used to it, he said, his voice rough. I'm a contractor. Contractors leave. Draco! I cut myself, he interrupted abruptly. He held up his left hand. A jagged cut ran across the palm, oozing bright red blood. He must have snagged it on a loose nail in the floorboard or a sharp edge of the charcoal. Hermione was off the sofa in an instant. The instinct to heal was as deep in her as the instinct to breathe. She knelt beside him, taking his hand in hers. You idiot, she whispered, but her tone was gentle. Why didn't you say anything? It's just a scratch. It's deep. She pulled her wand from her sleeve. Hold still. She didn't cast the spell immediately. She held his hand, her thumb brushing over the calluses, over the lifeline that was cut by the wound. His hand was large, warm, and trembling slightly. Draco was watching her. He wasn't looking at his hand. He was looking at her face. His gaze was intense, heavy with something he was trying very hard to suppress. Hermione, he breathed. The use of her name hit her like a physical blow. Her eyes snapped up to meet his. They were inches apart. The firelight danced in his eyes, turning the grey to molten silver. The air between them suddenly felt thin, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on her arms stand up. She could see the flecks of gold in his irises. She could smell the scent of him. Rain, charcoal, and something uniquely Draco. Does it hurt? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Yes, he said. But he wasn't talking about the hand. He leaned in, just a fraction, a millimeter of surrender. Hermione's heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't pull away. She leaned forward, drawn into his gravity. For a terrifying, beautiful second, she thought he was going to kiss her. She wanted him to kiss her. The realization was a shockwave that shattered her last defenses. She wanted Draco Malfoy to kiss her in her living room on a rainy Sunday. Then, the clock on the mantel chimed the hour. The sound shattered the spell. Draco jerked back as if he had been burned. He snatched his hand away from hers, scrambling to his feet. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of panic and self-loathing. I need to check the perimeter wards, he stammered. The rain, it might weaken the barrier. Draco, wait, Hermione said, reaching out. No. He backed away toward the door, putting distance between them as if she were the danger. Don't. Just don't. He turned and fled into the hallway. The front door opened and slammed shut, swallowing him into the rainy night. Hermione remained kneeling on the floor. Her hands were empty. A drop of his blood was smeared on her thumb, stark and red against her skin. She brought her thumb to her lips, tasting the metallic tang of it. He was terrified. She could see it now. He wasn't running from her. He was running from the possibility that he could be wanted. He was running from the idea that he could be forgiven. She stood up, her legs shaky. She walked to the window and looked out into the darkness. She couldn't see him, but she knew where he was. He would be checking the wards, yes. But he would also be standing in the rain, letting the cold wash away the warmth of the fire, punishing himself for daring to feel at home. The emotional seesaw had tipped violently again. Moments ago, they were suspended in intimacy. Now, the chasm was wider than ever. But this time, Hermione didn't feel despair. She felt determination. He had fixed her stairs. He had fixed her foundation. He was fixing her roof. She looked at the empty spot on the floor where he had been sitting. "Tuesday," she whispered to the empty room. "You're not leaving on Tuesday." She went to the kitchen and began to prepare dinner. Something warm, something hearty, something that would be waiting for him when he finally came back in from the cold, shivering and defensive. Because he would come back. His tools were still here. And whether he admitted it or not, his home was slowly becoming this drafty, broken cottage with the girl who knew how to heal him, if only he would let her. She heard the back door open 40 minutes later, the heavy tread of boots, the silence of the kitchen waiting for him. She didn't turn around from the stove. "Stew," she said to the air. "It's ready in 10 minutes. Silence. Then the soft sound of a chair being pulled out. "Okay," he said. His voice was tired, stripped of the earlier panic, just tired. "Okay." The house settled around them, a wooden embrace, holding them together when they didn't know how to hold themselves. The atmosphere on Monday morning was brittle, a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark lake. The storm had retreated into a persistent, melancholy drizzle that cloaked the hills in white mist. Inside the cottage, the air was thick with the things they hadn't said. The phantom of that near kiss in the library and the frantic retreat into the rain. Draco was already in the attic when Hermione woke. She could hear the rhythmic, hollow thump-thump of his hammer. It was an aggressive sound, a physical manifestation of his need to work, to be useful, to be anything other than a man who had almost succumbed to a moment of weakness. Hermione brought him coffee, moving up the stairs with a tray. She found him balanced on a rafter, his silhouette sharp against the grey sky, visible through the skeletal roof. He was securing the new iron-charmed oak beams. Every movement was tense, his muscles corded like iron bands. He didn't look at her when she placed the tray on a stable trunk. "I need to finish the structural bracing before the temperature drops tonight," he said, his voice flat and professional. He was wearing his armor again, the distant, cold persona of a Malfoy doing a favor for a colleague. "The humidity is rising. If the joints swell before they're anchored, the whole ridge will be crooked." "Draco," she began, her voice soft, tentative. "Don't," he snapped. He finally looked at her, and the raw exhaustion in his eyes made her stop. His pupils were blown wide, making his grey eyes look like charcoal. "I'm working, Granger. Unless you found a way to magically forge iron in your kitchen, I don't have time for whatever this is." Whatever this is. Hermione felt a spark of anger, a familiar grounding heat. "This is my house. And you're acting like a martyr because you accidentally felt a human emotion yesterday." Draco dropped his hammer. The sound echoed through the rafters like a gavel. He swung down from the beam with practiced ease, landing inches away from her. The smell of cedar, sweat, and cold rain rolled off him. "I am a martyr to nothing," he hissed, his voice dropping into a dangerous low register. "I am here to fix a roof. I am not here to be your project. I am not here to be redeemed by the cleverest witch of her age in a cozy cottage by the woods." He took a step closer, crowding her into the shadow of a massive chimney stack. "Do you have any idea how much effort it takes for me to stand in this house and not feel the weight of every mistake I've ever made? This place, it's clean. You're clean. I'm just bringing the mud in." "You're not bringing mud in, Draco. You're fixing the foundation," she countered, refusing to back away. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her gaze was steady. "And you're the one who keeps looking for dirt to step in, just so you can complain about being stained." The tension between them was a physical thing, a cord stretched to the point of snapping. They stood in the grey, dusty light of the attic, two survivors of a war that had never really ended for them. Hermione saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the emotional seesaw tilting back toward warmth, toward the terrifying possibility of being seen. Then he looked away. The cold returned, sharper than before. "Go downstairs, Hermione. The air is going to get thin when I start the anchoring charms. You'll get a headache." He turned his back on her and picked up his hammer. The rejection stung more than his anger. Hermione stood there for a moment, her hands clenched at her sides, watching the man who had built her a library but wouldn't let her touch his hand. She left the coffee. She went downstairs. By afternoon, the house was vibrating with the intensity of his magic. It wasn't the groaning of decay she had grown used to. It was the hum of restoration. It felt like a low-frequency song, a deep om that resonated in her teeth. She tried to work on her ministry files, but the words blurred on the parchment. She found herself wandering from room to room, noticing the small things he had fixed without mentioning them. A loose floorboard in the pantry, a window latch that no longer stuck, a cupboard door that had been missing a hinge for 3 years. He was healing her home by stealth, even as he fought her off with thorns. Around 4 o'clock, the vibration stopped. A heavy, profound silence fell over the cottage. Hermione waited. 5 minutes. 10. Then she heard the sound of slow, heavy footsteps descending the stairs. She met him in the hallway. Draco looked like he had aged 5 years in a single day. His face was ash grey, and he was leaning heavily against the banister. The magical effort of anchoring the roof beams, doing the work of 4 wizards alone, had clearly drained him to the point of collapse. "It's done," he whispered. "The ridge is set. It's safe." He reached the bottom of the stairs, and his knees simply gave out. Hermione caught him. She wasn't a large woman, but she was strong, and she braced her shoulder under his arm, guiding him toward the living room sofa. He didn't fight her this time. He was too far gone for pride. He smelled of ozone and burnt sugar, the scent of magical burnout. "Sit," she commanded, easing him onto the velvet cushions. He slumped back, his head hitting the headrest, his eyes sliding shut. His breathing was shallow and ragged. Hermione didn't hesitate. She ran to the kitchen and grabbed a vial of pepper-up potion she kept for her own late-night research sessions and a glass of water. When she returned, she knelt on the floor between his knees. "Draco, drink this." He opened his eyes, bleary and unfocused. He looked down at her, and for a second the masks were gone. There was no Malfoy, no contractor, no former Death Eater. There was just a man who had given everything he had to make a roof hold. He reached for the glass, but his hands were shaking so violently the water sloshed over the rim. Hermione put her hand over his, steadying the glass. "I've got you," she murmured. "Just drink." She held the glass to his lips. He drank greedily, the potion bringing a faint, artificial flush to his cheeks. He coughed, steam curling from his ears, and then let out a long, shuddering breath. The silence that followed was different. It was the trust side of the seesaw. The vulnerability of his collapse had stripped away the barbs. He stayed leaning back, his eyes half closed, his hand still trapped under hers on the glass. He didn't pull away. He let his fingers curl slightly around hers. "Why do you care?" he asked, his voice a mere thread of sound. "I've spent a decade being the villain in your story. Why are you helping me?" "Because you're not a villain anymore, Draco," she said, her voice firm. "Villains don't spend 4 days meticulously restoring a fireplace because they know the owner gets cold in the evenings. Villains don't treat a house like a living thing. I was just doing the job. Liar." He let out a dry, hacking laugh that turned into a groan of pain. "I'm a mess, Granger." "You're exhausted," she corrected. She set the glass on the floor and reached out, her fingers hovering near his temple. "May I?" He hesitated, then gave a microscopic nod. She placed her hands on either side of his head, her thumbs resting just above his brows. She began a gentle, rhythmic massage, a simple charm to soothe the magical pathways in his brain. Draco's eyes closed. A soft, broken sound escaped his throat, half sigh, half sob. He leaned his weight forward, his forehead coming to rest against her shoulder. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was the collapse of a weary soldier. Hermione held him. She shifted, so she was sitting on the edge of the sofa, drawing his head into the crook of her neck. She felt the dampness of his hair, the heat of his skin, and the way his entire body was trembling with the aftershocks of the magic he'd expended. "It's okay," she whispered into the silence of the room. "The house is safe. You did it." They sat like that for a long time as the twilight turned the room to indigo. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting a soft orange light over them. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, replaced by the quiet, heavy stillness of a frost. The tension between "can't stand it" and "can't help but think" was still there, but it was being drowned out by the sheer, overwhelming reality of their shared presence. Finally, Draco moved. He didn't pull away, but he shifted his head so he was looking up at her from her lap. The vulnerability in his expression was devastating. "Don't let me leave on Tuesday," he whispered. Hermione's heart skipped a beat. "I thought you were a contractor. I thought contractors leave." "The roof isn't finished," he said, his voice regaining a tiny bit of its usual silkiness, though it was still fragile. "The slate needs to be laid. The flashing needs to be leaded. It will take at least another week." Hermione smiled, a genuine, warm thing that lit up her face. She reached down and brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "Then you'd better stay," she said. "I'd hate for the ridge beam to get lonely." Draco didn't smile back, but the tightness in his jaw vanished. He closed his eyes again, his hand finding the hem of her cashmere jumper and gripping it as if anchoring himself to her. The house around them felt solid, watertight. For the first time, it didn't feel like a sanctuary she was hiding in. It felt like a home she was building. "Tomorrow," he murmured, already drifting into a potion-induced sleep. The slate. "Tomorrow," she agreed, her hand resting on the back of his neck, feeling the steady, strong beat of his pulse. The seesaw had tipped to warmth, and this time the ice felt like it might finally be thick enough to walk on. Tuesday arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum, cold and biting. The frost had turned the garden into a landscape of jagged diamonds, and the air inside the cottage was crisp, smelling of the dying embers of the hearth and the sharp metallic scent of the iron-charmed beams settling into their new home. Draco was gone from the sofa when Hermione descended the stairs. For a panicked heartbeat, she thought the contractor had finally fled the weight of the previous night's vulnerability. But then she heard the rhythmic, scraping sound of slate being moved. He was already on the roof. She found him standing on the scaffolding he had conjured, his silhouette stark against the pale morning light. He looked different today. The frantic, jagged energy of the past few days had been replaced by a quiet, brooding focus. He was laying the first row of slates with a precision that bordered on the religious. Hermione climbed the ladder, her breath hitching in the cold air. "You should be resting. The pepper-up only lasts so long, Draco." He didn't look up, but the hand holding the trowel paused. "The frost is the best time for the sealant to cure. If I wait, the moisture from the thaw will get under the ridge." He glanced at her over his shoulder, his eyes shadowed. "Besides, I don't know how to do rest when there's a hole in the sky." "There isn't a hole anymore," she said, stepping onto the platform beside him. "You filled it." The look he gave her was complicated, a mixture of gratitude and the old, familiar wariness. The intimacy of the previous night, of him sleeping with his head in her lap, sat between them like an unexploded charm. "The physical hole is gone," he muttered, turning back to the slate. "The rest takes longer." They worked in a comfortable, focused silence for the next few hours. Hermione had become his apprentice, handing him the heavy stones, helping him align the runes that would make the roof impenetrable to both weather and unwanted magic. As the sun climbed higher, a weak, watery gold, the atmosphere began to shift. The seesaw was moving again, but this time it wasn't a violent tip. It was a slow, agonizing slide toward a truth they were both trying to outrun. By midday, the front half of the roof was a shimmering sea of perfect, dark slate. Draco climbed down, his face flushed from the wind, his hands covered in the grey dust of the stone. "Lunch," Hermione commanded, not giving him room to argue. Inside the kitchen, the warmth was a physical embrace. She had made a simple soup, the kind of domestic, ordinary task that felt increasingly like a sacred ritual. They sat at the small table, their knees nearly touching in the cramped space. "My mother sent an owl," Draco said suddenly, his spoon hovering over his bowl. Hermione froze. The mention of Narcissa Malfoy brought the outside world crashing back into their bubble. "And?" "She wants to know when I'm returning to the manor. She says the East Wing is drafty." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "She thinks I'm on a business trip. She has no idea I'm playing carpenter for the Ministry's favourite witch." "Is that what this is? Playing?" Draco set his spoon down. The mask of the cool, detached contractor began to crumble. "You know it isn't. I haven't slept this well in years, Granger, even on that miserable sofa." He looked around the kitchen, his gaze lingering on the fixed window, the polished counter, the floorboards that no longer groaned. I've spent 5 years trying to fix myself by hiding. I didn't realize I needed to build something instead. You built this, she said softly, reaching across the table. Her fingers brushed the back of his hand, which was rough and scarred. You fixed my home. But Draco, you're part of it now. The house doesn't just feel safe because of the slate. It feels safe because you're in it. He flinched, pulling his hand back as if he'd been burned. The repulsion side of the trope flared up, the deep-seated belief that he didn't deserve the warmth she was offering. Don't, he hissed. Don't make me into something I'm not. I'm a man who was branded like cattle. I'm a man who stood by and watched people die. You're Hermione Granger. You're supposed to be with someone who has a soul that hasn't been put through a meat grinder. I don't want someone perfect, she snapped, her voice rising with a sudden, fierce passion. I want someone who knows what it's like to be broken and decides to pick up a hammer anyway. I want someone who stays. The silence that followed was deafening. Hermione's heart was pounding. She had said it. She had laid the final brick of the wall she'd been building between them, or perhaps she had just torn it down. Draco stared at her, his grey eyes wide and terrifyingly dark. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a precipice, deciding whether to jump or fly. I can't stay, Hermione, he whispered, his voice cracking. The job will be finished, the roof will be sealed, and then what? Do I just exist here, in your shadow? No, she said, standing up and walking around the table. She stopped right in front of him, forcing him to look up at her. You exist with me, not as a contractor, not as a debtor, as Draco. She reached out, her hands framing his face. His skin was cold from the roof, but beneath it, she could feel the heat of his blood, the frantic pulse in his jaw. She leaned down, her forehead resting against his. Fixing the house was the easy part, she murmured. Letting someone live in it, that's the real work. Draco let out a broken, shuddering breath. His hands came up, hovering near her waist, hesitant before finally clenching into the fabric of her jumper. He pulled her closer, burying his face in her stomach, his body trembling with the weight of years of repressed loneliness. I don't know how to do this, he choked out into the soft wool of her clothes. We'll learn, she said, her fingers weaving through his hair. One board at a time. The tension in the kitchen was no longer the sharp, jagged edge of their past. It was the heavy, sweet pressure of a new foundation being poured. The house around them seemed to lean in, the walls holding them steady as they navigated the first real moment of trust that wasn't born of necessity. But as always with the seesaw, the height of the warmth was shadowed by the fear of the fall. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the house. It wasn't the sound of a structural failure. It was the sound of a ward being breached. Draco was on his feet in a second, his wand in his hand, his eyes instantly shifting back to the cold, lethal grey of a protector. He pushed Hermione behind him, his body a shield between her and the door. Stay here, he commanded, his voice like iron. Draco, the wards are yours. Who could get through? Someone with the same blood, he muttered, his face pale. The front door swung open with a slow, ominous creak. The air in the hallway turned freezing, a magical chill that had nothing to do with the Derbyshire winter. Lucius Malfoy did not enter the house so much as he invaded it. He stood in the doorway, his silver-headed cane tapping against the floorboards Draco had spent 3 days polishing. He looked around the modest, cosy hallway with a sneer of pure, unadulterated disgust. "So," the elder Malfoy drawled, his voice like silk over a dagger. "This is where the scion of the House of Malfoy has been hiding, playing servant to a mudblood in a hovel." The word hit the room like a physical blow. Draco didn't flinch. He didn't move. But the magical pressure radiating from him was so intense that the plates on the table began to rattle. "Get out of this house, Father," Draco said. It wasn't a request. It was a threat. "You've forgotten your place, Draco," Lucius said, stepping further into the room, his eyes finding Hermione. The malice in his gaze was cold and ancient. "You think fixing a roof for her will wash off the mark? You think she sees anything but a pathetic, broken tool?" "He is more of a man than you ever were," Hermione spat, stepping out from behind Draco. Her hand was on her wand, her eyes blazing with a fury that made Lucius pause. "And this is my house. You are not invited. You are not welcome. And if you don't leave this instant, I will show you exactly what the Ministry's favourite witch can do to an intruder." Lucius laughed, a dry, hollow sound. He looked at his son, his expression turning to one of twisted pity. "Look at you, protecting her, like a well-trained dog. Come, Draco. Mother is waiting. Let the girl have her ruin. It's all she deserves." Draco looked at his father. Then he looked back at Hermione. For a terrifying second, she saw the old doubt, the old fear of his lineage, flicker in his eyes. The seesaw tipped toward the cold, toward the weight of the Malfoy name. "I'm not finished with the roof," Draco said quietly. Lucius sneered. "The roof? You're talking about slate while your legacy is in the dirt." "I'm talking about my life," Draco said, his voice growing stronger. He took a step toward his father, his wand tip glowing with a low, dangerous light. "I am building something here, something you could never understand. Now leave, before I make you." Lucius stared at his son, realizing for the first time that the boy he could once break with a look was gone. He saw the scars on Draco's hands, the dirt on his clothes, and the steady, unshakable gaze. With a huff of aristocratic disdain, he turned on his heel. "You will regret this," Lucius said, his voice echoing in the hallway. "When she grows tired of her pet Death Eater, don't come crawling back to the manor." He vanished with a sharp, violent crack. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The front door remained open, letting the freezing wind whistle through the house. Draco didn't move. He stood with his back to Hermione, his shoulders hunched, his wand hand shaking. The intrusion had shattered the fragile peace of the afternoon, bringing the harsh, ugly light of the world back into their sanctuary. The cold had returned. Hermione walked to him, her heart aching. She reached out to touch his arm, but he flinched away. "He's right," Draco whispered, his voice thick with self-loathing. "I'm just a pet to you, a project, a way to feel good about your own mercy." "Draco, no. I need to finish the roof," he said, his voice turning robotic. He walked past her, out the open door and into the cold, not looking back. "It's going to rain tonight. The sealant needs to be set." Hermione watched him go, her hand resting on the banister. The house felt cold again. Not because of the open door, but because the man who had been fixing it had just broken himself all over again. The repairs were almost finished. The house was almost safe. But as she heard the first hammer strike on the roof, Hermione realized that the hardest part of the renovation was yet to come. She had to convince the builder that he was allowed to live inside the walls he had created. The hammer fell with a rhythmic, punishing violence that echoed through the bones of the cottage. Hermione stood at the base of the ladder, staring up into the encroaching twilight. The sky had turned a sickly, bruised indigo, and the wind had a sharp metallic bite that promised snow. Draco was a dark silhouette against the fading light, working with a frantic, desperate speed that terrified her. He wasn't just laying slate. He was trying to outrun his own skin. "Draco, come down!" she shouted over the rising wind. "The storm is coming in. It's too dangerous to be up there." He didn't answer. The only response was the sharp clink of a chisel and the heavy thud of stone. He was ignoring her, retreating into the only thing he felt he had left, his utility. Hermione didn't wait. She climbed. The ladder swayed in the gusts, the cold metal biting into her palms. When she reached the scaffolding, she saw him. He was hunched over the ridge, his hair whipped into a silver frenzy by the gale. His fingers were bleeding, the skin torn by the rough edges of the slate, but he didn't seem to notice. He was casting localized warming charms on the sealant with his wand held in his teeth, while he positioned the final ridge tiles with his bare hands. "Stop it!" she cried, grabbing his shoulder. He spun around, and the look in his eyes was feral. The refined, weary contractor was gone, replaced by the ghost of the boy who had spent a year trying to fix a vanishing cabinet in a room of hidden things. "I have to finish it," he yelled over the howl of the wind. "If I finish it, it's done. The debt is paid. The house is whole." "You're not paying a debt. You're hurting yourself." Hermione gripped his forearms, her small hands barely meeting around his cabled muscles. "Look at me, Draco. Lucius is gone. He has no power here. This house belongs to us." The word "us" hit him like a physical blow. He froze, his chest heaving, his breath coming in ragged white plumes. The hammer slipped from his hand, sliding down the incline of the roof and disappearing into the darkness of the garden below. "There is no us," he whispered, the anger draining out of him, leaving only a hollow, terrifying despair. "There is the savior and the sinner. There is the girl who deserves the world and the man who helped burn it. He's right, Hermione. I'm a ghost in your house." "Then let me be haunted," she countered, her voice cracking. "I've been alone in this silence for so long, Draco. I'd rather have your ghosts than this emptiness." A sudden, violent crack of thunder shook the air, and the sky opened up. It wasn't rain. It was sleet, hard, icy pellets that stung the skin and made the fresh slate as slippery as glass. Draco's foot slipped. He let out a sharp gasp, his body lurching toward the edge. Hermione screamed, her hands flying out to catch him. She caught the front of his jacket, her heels digging into the wooden planks of the scaffolding, her magic flaring instinctively to anchor them both. For a heartbite, they hung there, suspended over the drop, the ice pelting them like stones. Then Draco found his footing, his hand slamming onto the ridge beam he had so carefully reinforced. He pulled himself back, dragging Hermione with him until they were both huddled against the chimney stack, shivering and soaked to the bone. "See," he choked out, his eyes wild. "I bring nothing but disaster." "You brought me the stars," she whispered, her teeth chattering. She reached up, cupping his face with her frozen hands. You fixed the roof so I could see them without being cold. That's not disaster. That's love, Draco." The word hung between them, more powerful than the storm. Draco's eyes searched hers, searching for the lie, for the pity, for the mercy he so feared. He found none. He found only the stubborn, brilliant fire of the woman who had never known how to give up on a lost cause. He broke. He pulled her into him, his arms wrapping around her with a crushing force, his face burying in the crook of her neck. He wasn't crying, but he was making a sound, a low, ragged keening that came from deep within his chest. It was the sound of a foundation finally settling, of the internal rot being purged by the sheer force of being wanted. "I'm sorry," he breathed into her skin. "I'm so sorry." "Come inside," she pleaded, her voice muffled by his shoulder. "Please, just come home." They navigated the descent in a daze of ice and adrenaline. By the time they reached the kitchen, they were both blue-lipped and trembling. The house, sensing their distress, seemed to pulse with warmth. The fire in the living room flared to life without a wand being raised, and the kettle on the stove began to hiss. Hermione didn't let him go. She led him to the bathroom, her hands working the buttons of his sodden shirt. He stood like a statue, his eyes fixed on her, his pupils blown wide. "Sit," she murmured, pointing to the edge of the clawfoot tub. She turned on the taps, the steam rising in thick, fragrant clouds. She added salts that smelled of eucalyptus and sandalwood, the expensive ones she had been saving for a day she felt she deserved them. "Take your clothes off, Draco. You're going to get pneumonia." He obeyed, his movements slow and mechanical. When he stepped into the water, he let out a long, shuddering groan. Hermione sat on the closed lid of the toilet, watching him. The bathroom was small, intimate, the air growing heavy with moisture. She took a sponge and began to wash the grit and blood from his back. Her touch was light, reverent. She traced the silver scars, the marks of his father's legacy, and the new raw scrapes from her roof. "I finished the ridge," he said quietly, his head bowed. "The last tile, I set the charm just as the sleet started. It's watertight, Hermione. You'll never have a leak again." "I know," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to the space between his shoulder blades, right over his spine. Draco stiffened, his breath hitching. He turned around in the tub, the water splashing over the sides. He grabbed her wrists, his grip firm but no longer desperate. "Why?" he asked. "After everything, why me?" "Because you're the only one who noticed the house was screaming," she said. "Everyone else saw the deputy head of the ministry. You saw a girl who was afraid of her own stairs. You fixed the things I didn't know how to ask for." She reached out, her thumb tracing the line of his lower lip. "I don't need a hero, Draco. I've had enough heroes to last a lifetime. I just need someone who stays to finish the job." Draco leaned into her hand, his eyes closing. The seesaw had finally found its equilibrium. The tension was no longer a battle. It was a bridge. "I'm not leaving," he whispered, "unless you throw me out." "I've locked the wards," she said with a small, watery smile. "And you're the one who made them so strong. You're trapped, Malfoy." "Good," he murmured. He reached up, his hand tangling in her damp hair, and pulled her down. The kiss was not like the storm outside. It wasn't violent or sudden. It was slow, tentative, and tasted of salt and wood smoke. It was a question and an answer all at once. It was the sound of a door being locked against the cold and a fire being stoked for the night. When they finally broke apart, the silence in the room was absolute. The house was quiet. No groans, no creaks, just the steady rhythmic sound of two people breathing in the dark. "I need to dry you off," she whispered, her forehead against his. "Later," he said, pulling her back into the warmth of the steam. "Just stay for a minute." They sat in the quiet of the glowing bathroom as the sleet turned to snow outside, muffling the world. The repairs were finished. The structure was sound. And for the first time since the war ended, Hermione Granger felt like she wasn't just surviving. She was home. But as the night deepened, she knew there was one final thing they had to face. The morning would bring the realization that the contract was over, and they would have to decide what to call the space that was left behind. Tuesday morning arrived with a blinding, pristine whiteness. The snow that had fallen overnight draped the Derbyshire hills in a thick velvet quilt, swallowing the jagged sounds of the outside world. Inside the cottage, there was a silence so profound it felt like a living blessing, a peace that only exists in places where the war has finally, truly ended. Hermione woke to a weight across her waist that felt unfamiliar, yet profoundly right. She didn't open her eyes at first, instead focusing on the sensation of heat seeping through her skin. It wasn't the feverish, desperate heat of exhaustion, but a steady, domestic warmth. She turned her head slightly and saw Draco. He was still asleep, sprawled across her bed on top of the duvet, fully dressed in the clean, dry shirt she had forced him into after his bath. His face, usually a map of sharp angles and guarded cynicism, had smoothed into something soft and vulnerable. Without his mask of pure-blood arrogance or professional detachment, he looked almost young. His hand, mapped with small nicks and scars from stone and wood, rested possessively but gently over her ribs. Hermione lay still, afraid to shatter the fragile grace of the moment. She looked up at the ceiling, the same ceiling that had once threatened to bury her, and saw that it was perfectly level, dry, and silent. Every crack had been filled. Every ghost of the past had been exorcised by the steady rhythm of his hammer. Draco stirred. His eyelashes fluttered, and a moment later he opened his eyes. For a few seconds there was nothing in his gaze but raw, unadulterated recognition. Then consciousness returned, and with it the slight shadow of doubt that always followed him into the daylight. "You're still here," he rasped, his voice low and heavy like honey. "It's my house, Draco," she smiled, trailing her fingers along his jawline, feeling the faint prickle of stubble. "I'm not going anywhere." He intercepted her hand, pressing a long, weighted kiss into the center of her palm. It was a slow, deliberate gesture of surrender. "The repairs are finished," he said, searching her eyes. "The ridge holds. The stairs are silent. The foundation is sealed. I know. That means—" He hesitated, and she saw him starting to reach for his armor again. "That means the contract is fulfilled. There is no logical reason for me to stay. I should probably be heading back to the manor today." Hermione sat up, her hair cascading over her shoulders in a wild chestnut halo. She looked at him with the same fierce determination that had carried her through the darkest days of the war. "You've forgotten one thing, Malfoy." "What's that?" "I checked every inch of the structural work." "You're a very poor architect if you think a house is just made of walls," she said softly. "You fixed everything except for one detail." He frowned, a spark of genuine interest flickering in his grey eyes. "Which one? Tell me." "There are too many empty chairs in this house," she whispered. "And there's coffee in the kitchen that I don't know how to brew the way you do. And the library. It's going to be far too quiet if you're not there to argue with me about 5th century spellcraft." Draco froze. His fingers tightened around her hand. "You aren't asking me to stay for the sake of the architecture." It was a statement, not a question. "I'm asking you to stay because without you, this is just a building again, and I want it to be a home, our home." He was silent for a long time. Hermione watched the internal battle play out across his face, the struggle between the old fear of being unworthy and the new, terrifying desire to simply be happy. Finally, he gave a slow, shaky nod. The tension he had carried in his shoulders for years seemed to evaporate. "I'll need to move my books," he said, his voice regaining its silky, self-assured edge. "And my specialized tools. And that shelf in the sitting room. It's always bothered me. I'll have to rebuild it." Hermione laughed, a bright, clear sound that made Draco's lips curve into a genuine smile. It was the first real smile she had seen on him. Not a smirk, not a weary grimace, but something warm and hopeful. They went downstairs together. The kitchen was cold, but the moment Draco waved his wand, the stove roared to life. He began the ritual of making coffee, and Hermione realized that this sound, the grinding of beans, the clink of ceramic, the low hum of water, would now be the soundtrack of her mornings. She stepped up behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her cheek against his back. Draco covered her hands with his own. "You know," he said, looking out at the snow-covered garden, "I always thought restoration was about returning things to the way they were, before the war, before the mistakes. And now? Now I think it's about taking the broken pieces and building something entirely new, something that's stronger than the original because it knows exactly where it was once cracked." He turned in her arms and lifted her chin. His eyes were the color of light granite, steady, clear, and certain. "Thank you for letting me build this, Hermione. Thank you for staying to live in it." They ate breakfast in a silence that was no longer heavy or charged. It was the silence of two people who had finally found their harbor. Draco began making a list of things to do, not because he had to, but because he wanted to care for this space. He spoke of new garden wards, of bookshelves, and of how they would go to London together to pick out materials. Hermione listened to him and felt a profound peace bloom in her chest. She was no longer a woman hiding in a ruin. She was home. As the sun rose higher, illuminating every perfectly aligned board and every clean corner, it was clear the house was safe. And for the first time since the war ended, so were they. Draco took her hand and led her to the sofa, the same lumpy sofa that was now the most comfortable place in the world. He pulled her into his side, and she tucked her feet under his legs. Outside, the winter still held the world in its icy grip. But inside the cottage, protected by new, strong walls and a ridge beam that had been set with love, it was spring. He didn't have to leave, and he didn't. The house was safe, and so were they.
To me, this story is not about bricks and mortar, It is about the quiet courage it takes to heal. I love how the house acts as a mirror for Draco and Hermione's souls. They are both broken in different ways. She is exhausted by her own strength, and he is hollowed out by his past. What strikes me most in the power of silence in this journey. It starts as cold, sharp wall between enemies, but slowly transforms into a warm, protective shield. I enjoyed writing the soft moments, the shared tea, the smell of sawdust, and the way Draco cares for her home as a way of asking for forgiveness. It is a very human story about finding a safe place to land. It proves that sometimes the most magical thing you can do for someone is simply to show up and stay until the storm passes.